Welcome everyone to the online conference on the Marxist Political Economy in Russia by Dr. François Allisson. Thank you so much for being here. This conference is organized by Rethinking Economics Lausanne, that is based in Switzerland at the Lake of Geneva. We are the Lausanne branch of Rethinking Economics, that is an international organization for pluralism in economics. I think most of you should be aware of us because there are many people joining in from our network. And today I'm really happy to welcome François Allisson, the speaker of this conference. François Allisson is a senior lecturer at the Walras-Pareto Center at the University of Lausanne. He is a historian of economic thought with a background in economics. And most importantly, he is a specialist in the Russian economic thought. Amongst many articles covering the Russian economic thought, he has published an award-winning book, Value and Prices in Russian Economic Thought, from the 1890 until 1920. That was also the topic of his PhD thesis. So after this short introduction, I want to mention some remarks about the housekeeping rules. So please mute your microphone. Also be aware that we are recording this conference, so turn off your video as well if you do not feel comfortable ending up in the video recording. And the conference will take around 40 minutes, and afterwards the speaker will answer your questions during the remaining 20 minutes. And please write your questions to the speaker directly in the chat such that he can answer them in the end of his presentation. So I will simply collect the questions and then do some kind of a moderation. So now I'm looking forward to this exciting presentation. The floor is yours, Mr. François Allisson.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I would like to thank first the organizers of this online conference, Rethinking Economics Lausanne, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank also the help that Rethinking Economics Lausanne provided to our previous conference that we organized at the Center Walras-Pareto in Lausanne. It was the 18th International Conference of the Association Charles Gide pour l'étude de la pensée économique, which gathered the French-speaking community of historians of economics in Lausanne. It was during the pandemic, and Andreas in particular provided great help during this partly online and partly physical conference. So I'm very happy to speak to you about these topics, which are no longer very often discussed. And here you can see a post, a mark from 1967 celebrating the 100th birth of Marx Das Kapital, the book on which it will be questioned today. So, Marxist Political Economy in Russia. I would like to start with the plan of my speech. First, I would speak about a few contradictions in the very meaning of my title. How is it possible to speak of Marxist political economy and in Russia? And nevertheless, and despite this contradiction, I will tell you a few words about that, implying to look at how the economists called Sieber approached the theory of value. And I will also say a few words about Tugan-Baranovsky's schemes of reproduction as taking part of this Marxist political economy in Russia. But before I start, I would like to give you some literature about this topic. I owe a great deal to James White's book about Marx and Russia, which tells the relationships between Marx and Russians and how the Russians integrated the Marxian thought in their own journey in Russia. And if you have no idea about the great picture of all the revolutionary movements in Russia, I would really like to recommend the book of my colleague from the University of Geneva, Corinne Amacher, who tells all these movements in Russia from the end of the 16th till the October and February Revolution. So these are a few references, and very lately there have been quite a lot of books in 2019 and 2020 about the late Marx. Why? I don't know why, but the late Marx is very much the Marx interested in Russian political economy. And so here I just give a few examples. If you see Marcello Musto's The Last Years of Karl Marx, an intellectual biography, the subtitle of this book is 1881-1883. So a whole intellectual biography of 2 years of the last years of Karl Marx, who really is interested in the fate of Russia along the debates that I will cover in a few minutes. And once you've read all this, then you can just take a look at my book that about which Andreas said a few words. And if you are more interested in what happens in the Soviet period, then I can only recommend to you the last volume edited by my colleagues Till Dupé and Ivan Boldirev about economic knowledge in socialism in the second half of the 20th century. So let's start now with my first slide, first point, a few contradictions. The first contradiction is about Marxist political economy by itself. There should not be a Marxist political economy, according to some. But according to others, sorry, there is a mistake here, Mars, it should be Marx. Life on Marx and not on Mars. And so there should not be a Marxist political economy. Why do I say this sentence? Because Marx set himself the goal to produce a critique of political economy. And a critique of political economy intends not to continue the development of economics, but to put an end to the development of political economy as a science. And if you take this aim seriously, then there should be no Marxian political economist after Marx, because he should have been the one who stopped this movement. But at the same time, a lot of economists, and notably in the socialist camp, thought that Marx was the basis of a renewed classical political economy after Smith and Ricardo, which would go in another direction from the one implied by my old Léon Walras and Menger and Jevons along the marginalist revolution and neoclassical economics. And it's like if there was two Marx, and you have to choose. And the problem is that Marx himself hesitated, because at some time he was really focused on his goal of producing a critique of political economy, but at some times he played the game and he thought himself as an economist after Smith and Ricardo. So the point here was, is Marx a critical theorist or an economist? And if you answer he is a critical theorist, as most philosophers would agree, then there is no sense of continuing my speech today, because there should not be a Marxist political economy. But Marx himself, as I told you, sometimes considered himself an economist, and sometimes even a better economist than the others, which he called the bourgeois or the vulgar economist. And therefore, I am in right to continue this talk. But you should bear in mind this contradiction all along the path that we will go today, and that you will perhaps continue after that. The second contradiction is concerns Russia, because it was clear for Marx and for Engels since the publication of the manifesto of the Communist Party and of the publication of Marx Capital, Volume 1 in 1867, that the analysis contained in Capital, which was an analysis, a critical analysis of capitalism, concerned what was intended for the most advanced industrialized countries like England and to a lesser degree Germany, Netherlands, and so on. And Russia was the last country they sought where this theory could have an impact. And so why? Because in England, there was a proletariat, there was capital accumulation, there was industrial crisis, all the topics that Marx was discussing in his book was taking place in England. But in Russia, it was not the case, because there was still serfdom until 1861. There was no proletariat, there was no capitalist accumulation, and so it was a kind of a surprise why this analysis of the most advanced capitalistic countries should have any interest for Russia. But at the same time, if you remember the pictures of the old Marx that I showed you at the beginning, the old Marx took an interest for Russia and its internal debates about the fate of capitalism in Russia. And because of this question, I am allowed to speak a bit of Russia in this talk, but it was absolutely not intended for Marx since the beginning. And now I turn to the third contradiction. It is that the reception of capital in Russia was really complex. To say, to tell you that in a few words, there was in the Russian debates a struggle in the mid-19th century between two camps, the Slavophiles on the one side and the Westernizers on the other side. And these were absolutely not, they didn't agree about the economic development of Russia in the future. For the Westernizers, Russia was a backward country who shall try to catch up with the most advanced countries, the Western countries from Western Europe. And so it was necessary to be patient in order to get to see one day capitalism arriving up to Russia. And on the other side, among the intelligentsia, there were the Slavophiles, and the Slavophiles thought that capitalism was a Western affair for the Western countries, and Russia could get on its own way. And this way was implied the institution that we call the Община, that you see the name here, the Общina. The Общina was a communal institution, an agrarian communal institution with a kind of collective land ownership, which was absolutely alien to all to private property and to the idea of progress in a capitalistic sense. And so it was a basis for, at the same time, for conservative people who wanted the country to stay an agrarian state. And it was also for some progressive Slavophiles the basis of the future, because if there is no private property in the countryside, then why should Russia go along the line of private property, industrialization, capitalism, and all that comes along, like the proletariat and the revolutions and so on. And so the Slavophiles were hoping that it was possible to build a socialist society based on the Obshina, the specific agrarian and rural institution, without having to follow the Western path. And when Marx's Capital arrived in Russia in the early 1870s, these two groups, the Slavophile and the Westernizers, changed a bit. There were some reconfigurations, and there were now two groups. The first group was called the Populist, and the second group called themselves the Marxists. And the Marxists were the followers of the Westernizers, so they believe in the power of capitalism, and they believe that industrialization was taking place in Russia. On the other side, the populists, who were who took the legacy of the Slavophile, believed that capitalism was not developing in Russia, that capitalism could not develop in Russia because of this specific institution, and that it is better if it was not developing in Russia. And so what is a bit complex in this story is that Marx's Russian friends were populists. So Marx was on the side of the populists, and it was a populist economist, Danielson, who translated the Marx's Capital into Russian. And so when Marx learned that there were people that called themselves Marxist in Russia, it was in this context that he said that if it is true, then I, Marx, am not a Marxist myself, because in the last years of his life, Marx was thinking that perhaps his story of the development of capitalism leading to the apparition of another mode of production, which would lead to the socialist society, was perhaps only a Western affair and not necessarily a universal theory of development. And this had or could have tremendous implications, because if the story told by Marx was only true for Western countries, then there were alternative paths for most of the world, and especially for Russia, India, and a lot of countries around the world that were not following from the beginning the same path as the Western and especially English economies. And so at some point, until at the very end of Marx's life, someone called Vera Zasulich, who will be one of the first Russian Marxists, wrote a letter to Marx to ask him if he thought that the Obshina could be the basis of a future socialist development in Russia. And Marx produced a lot of drafts which we have now as scholars, where he longly hesitated, and he ended to answer that his theory was only good for Western countries, and Russia could follow his own path based on the Obshchina. Of course, now we know the end of the story. The end of the story is that the Russian Revolution was headed by those Marxists who took the legacy of the Westernizers, and so Marx proved to be wrong about the reception of his book in Russia. He was on the wrong side of history. So just to tell you that it is difficult to speak about a Russian political economy in Russia and a Marxist political economy in Russia is only possible on this line. Those who believe that Marx was an economist and was producing a universal theory of economic development. And it is in this line that in the 1870s, 1880s, and the 1890s, that a lot of Russian economists produced economic ideas based on Marx capital, which we now can call Marxist political economy, and which were reused then after in the Western world. So that was my introduction, and now I will just say a few words about two case studies of Marxian political economy in Russia. First case study about Sieber's theory of value, and second case study about Tugan-Baranovsky's schemes of reproduction. So I don't know, what is your knowledge of the labor theory of value? I don't know if you are aware that before the marginalist revolution, there was a labor theory of value. I hope.
I mean, I cannot speak for everyone, but I don't know that much about it. Probably because of that, I've joined this club.
Okay, thank you, Andreas, for this clarification. So Nikolai Ivanovich Sieber is someone on which I worked the last years. It is, according to me and a few colleagues of mine, Federico Donofrio, Danila Raskov, and Leonid Shirokorad, the first Russian Marxist, the very first. He was dismissed this place because of the Russian and Soviet historiography, and now people say that Plekhanov was the first Russian Marxist, but Sieber was the first. He was born in today's Ukraine, in Crimea, and he was, by the way, a citizen of, his father was a citizen of Zurich, of Fluntern, and so this Swiss-Russian economist was really the first Marxist political economist, according to us. So his book from 1871, so 4 years after the publication of Marx Capital, and 1 year before the publication of the Russian translation of Marx Capital, he published a book called David Ricardo's Theory of Value and Capital. And this book will appear in an English edition at the end of this year for the first time. And this is a book which Karl Marx called an excellent book about my own theory of value. So this is one of the very scarce mention by Marx of someone who understood his own theory of value, and this makes this book very special and very intriguing that it has not been translated until now. And so in this book, Sieber is not pretending that Marx is a critique of political economists, but that he is the perfect continuator of David Ricardo. So Marx is a post-Ricardian economist, and he provided improvements in the latest theory of value. There is a paper from the 1970s by George Stigler called Ricardo's 93% labor theory of value. Why 93%? Because you probably know the story that you can account for the number of hours that are embedded in the commodity by simply taking account of the fact that to produce, I don't know, to produce a computer, you need a certain numbers of hours of labor, direct labor, and you need a lot of tools and materials. And to produce these tools, you simply need hours of labor and other tools and materials. And to produce the materials as well, you need hours of labor and so on. And if you go up to the first tool invented in humanity, then you are able to get to a pure labor theory of value to explain how many hours are needed to produce a single commodity and the present conditions of production. That's the standard narrative of the labor theory of value. But if you introduce capital in it, then you introduce something called profit and interest rate, and you introduce time, and then these imply that you cannot no longer, if you have different time structure of production, you can no longer compare two goods produced by different capital goods. And Ricardo himself, who was a proponent of the labor theory of value, recognized that there was a kind of problem along this line, and he made calculation to say that the complications implied by capital in the calculation of labor value amounts only to 7%. And so Stigler said, at the time of Ricardo, we could speak of a 93% labor theory value. And now that the accumulation of capital took such a pace, the labor theory of value vanished, and we can no longer speak of this theory as something that that is correct. And therefore, Ricardo himself struggles between two kinds of theories: the labor theory of value, which are only hours of labor, direct and indirect, and a cost of production theory. And if you take the cost of production theory, the cost of production is composed by wages, which is labor, plus profit, plus rent. And in the cost of production theory, you introduce these complications, and therefore, for Stigler and for many economists after Ricardo, the labor theory of value is flawed, but the cost of production theory is correct, and the cost of production theory is perfectly integratable into a marginalist approach in which you get the marginal productivity of all capital goods, of labor, and so on. And so these Marxian stuff can be put in the trash. And so what Sieber did in his book was to try to rescue Ricardo from this posthumous critique that had not been yet pronounced at the time, using two different points of view. And in this sense, he tried to show how Marx improved the classical political economist. There is, according to Sieber, an individual point of view and a social point of view. And the capitalist or the vulgar economist is only interested in the individual point of view. He's interested in the categories of profit, of rent, of wages, because wage is something that he must pay, because profit is something that he earns. And so these are his own point of view. And the real economist, according to Sieber, is like Marx, only interested in the social point of view, trying to explain other categories of phenomena, and especially how do we understand the distribution of social labor among the different production activities, and so on. And therefore, these two theories just tell two different stories. One that is of interest for the bookkeeper, says Sieber, and the other that is of interest for the economist. And the labor theory of value, okay, is no good to tell exactly what are the prices of individual goods, but can explain how the society works and how the division of labor explains how many people are employed in each sector of the economy, and so on. And so this is a first step towards an understanding of a specific Marxist political economy as compared to what was in Ricardo a mix of both, of the social point of view and the individual point of view. And what Marx did that that Ricardo was not able to do is, for example, to distinguish the profit, which is an individual category, from the surplus value, which is a social category that can only be understood in the context of the labor theory of value. Surplus value is not the profit, and profit is not surplus value. They are from two different theoretical worlds, and this world is the beginning, according to me, of the Marxian political economy in Russia. That was my first case study, and I want to go to the second case study and last case study about Tugan-Baranovsky's schemes of reproduction. Here, I must ask you once again, have you ever seen Marxian schemes of reproduction? Can you perhaps answer in the chat? Or Mathieu says no. Sophie says no as well. Okay, so I will try. And Joel says yes, excellent. Joel will be my co-speaker. Let me start, perhaps. I still have 10 minutes if I'm right. Let me start perhaps with Marx's own reproduction schemes. Marx tried to represent the circulation and process of accumulation of capital in the whole economy by dividing the economy in two sectors. The first sector is interested in producing means of productions. So it is the sector who produce the machines used by other sectors or by itself. So the first sector is producing means of production. The second sector produces means of consumption. Nothing special here. You need to consume, but you may need to produce means of production before you can produce means of consumption at some point. And if I take a unit of account like the Swiss franc, you can I will write you the example put by Marx. Let's take this example. The sector of means of production, first sectors, need 4,000 Swiss francs of means of production, which is called constant capital in the Marxian terminology, and 1,000 of salaries, wages, or variable capital in the Marxian terminology, to be able to produce 6,000 for 6,000 francs of machine. So you invest 5,000 and you get 6 at the end. 4 in machine, 1,000 in value. How is that possible? That's the mystery of capitalism that you don't understand unless you enter in Marx Capital Volume 1. The mystery is called surplus value. It is the ability of variable capital to produce more than its own value, and the legal possibility offered to the owner of the means of production to legally steal this part of the work done by the workers as variable capital. 500 of variable capital plus 500 of surplus value, which means 3,000. This is what Marx called simple reproduction. Why simple reproduction? Because simple reproduction tells how is it possible that an economy can reproduce itself on a simple scale from one period to another. To see that, you see that you produce 6,000 of machine and 3,000 of means of consumption. It is perfectly in line with simple reproduction, because if I make the totals here for each row, for each column, then you see that I need 6,000 of machine to be able to reproduce the economy. And we produce 6,000 and we consume 6,000. We produce horizontally, we consume vertically. And how many means of consumption are needed for the workers? 1,500. And how many means of consumption the capitalists are able to eat themselves? Their surplus, which Ricardo would call their profit. But Marx insists that this is surplus. And if you see that to be able to reproduce, this economy needs 3,000 of means of consumption and 6,000 of machine, you see that this economy is able to reproduce itself from one year to another year. And so this was the basis of a tool to tell a story of how capital circulates in the economy. And then Marx told another story, which I will not tell here because I will show you instead Tugan-Boyanovsky's schemes. It is the story of expanded reproduction. That is, how is it possible for the economy to reproduce itself on an enlarged scale? And to be able to do that, you have to produce here more than what is needed here. But you have to do that by respecting some conditions of proportionality between these two sectors, because otherwise you will get crisis, and crisis will happen anyway during the whole story. So if I go back to what Tugan-Boyanovsky, who is, by the way, my favorite Russian economist, Tugan-Boyanovsky used and transformed these schemes of reproduction first by adding a third sector. We find the first sectors, means of production, the second sector, means of consumption for the workers. That's the difference. And third sector, luxury good for the capitalist. So that this is the consumption for capitalists, this is the consumption for the workers. And this makes us able to look at another dynamic. So you can see that in the first period, there is some constant capital, some variable capital, some surplus value, which amounts to a total production of 2,720, which is far more than what is needed to do simple reproduction. But that is not the aim of extended reproduction. The aim is to be able to produce more, to have a basis for production for the next period on an enlarged scale, and so on. So this is something rather classical that Marx did with two sectors and so on. But here the difference comes with the fact that some proportions that Marx evoked in his Capital, which are very important to understand the dynamics of capitalism, are these two proportions. The first is the proportion between constant capital and variable capital in each sector. This ratio is called by Marx the organic composition of capital, which means how many living labor you have compared to what he called dead labor or machine in which past labor is crystallized. And so here you can see that it is a ratio of 3:1. And here you got another ratio, which is called by Marx not the organic composition of capital like here, but the rate of exploitation. The rate of exploitation is how many you can get from how many you employ people. And so here the rate of exploitation is 100%. For each franc here, you get 1 franc here. And what is new, and this is once again a new step in the formation of a Marxist political economy in Russia, is that Tugan-Baranovsky used these schemes to tell a complex story in which he said, let's try to construct an experiment in which the capitalists are restraining themselves from consumption. That is, they are not looking for accumulation for luxury good. They keep 600 from period to period, which means they can accumulate in the other two sectors more. And let's try something else. Let's try to reduce at each term the salary of the workers. Let's get rid of workers because we only need machine to produce machine, etc., etc. So each time you see here the total amount of work produced or of means of consumption for workers decreases 680, 620, 611. So this is the perfect conditions to increase as fast as possible the first sector, which can go from 2.7 to 3.3 to 4.3. And with this story, if you continue the period, you would end to a theoretical world in which you get 600, you get almost no workers remaining, you get only one, and you get infinite accumulations of means of production for their own sake to produce other means of production that are able to produce means of production. So this is the abstract, completely absurd vision of capitalism and accumulation proposed by Tugan-Baranovsky, to say that even with this absurd situation, you are able to find outlets for all this production. because even if you produce a lot of machine and there is no longer any worker or one to buy means of consumption, there is no problem, because capitalists will buy machine to produce other machine to produce other machine. And this, which may sound a bit abstract nowadays, was an argument used by a westernizer Marxist against the Slavophile dreamers of people who thought that capitalism could not take place in Russia. So Marx was used in these debates by hacking these reproduction schemes. I say hacking because you can see that here the ratio between this and this is no longer 3:1. It is 3:0.75, which means 4:1. Why is 0.75? Because of the minus 25% of workers that we get rid at each time. And so the special conditions of reproduction that are needed to make this possible, 2017, 2680, is part of this increasingly mathematical Marxist political economy that took root in Russia even long before it took root in Germany. So I hope that these are just introductions. You can get the books if you want to get more info about these. But I hope I convince you of the strangeness of this Marxist political economy in Russia. But nevertheless, it is here. And nowadays, Marxist political economy is still using these reproduction schemes every day. And so this is only the beginning of the story. I thank you for your attention. I'm finished.
Thank you very much for your really clear and insightful introduction in Marxist economy.